Watch Dogs is a franchise that just never really got going properly. Announced back in 2012, this franchise appeared to promise something a little different, something unique, a contemporary open world game set within an interconnected city, one you could exploit and fashion into a weapon through hacking, a premise that showed boundless potential in the realms of sandbox, layered into what appeared to be a gripping thriller narrative. Prior to its release, the promotional content for this game made it out to be the next big thing, and it looked bloody cool and honestly still does. However, things didn't quite go to plan for two reasons. Reason 1, it was a Ubisoft game, but more importantly, reason 2, anything this game actually accomplished upon its release in 2014 was overshadowed by the controversy surrounding it. This was one of the most infamous examples of a graphical downgrade in a game. It didn't look dismal for 2014 standards, but it did look vastly flatter when compared to the promotional content, and a lot of players were immediately soured by that. Also, 2014 was a really rough year for Ubisoft games and optimization. This game was broken beyond belief when it released, and I felt the worst of that one because I played on PC. In hindsight, it's probably not the worst offender in this respect, but it's definitely one I remember more because I was soured. I genuinely look forward to playing it, and it being hardly playable made me quite upset. And that blinded a younger me to the potential of this game, a potential that now seems destined to go amiss. I'm not just talking about the rumours that the Watch Dogs franchise is dead and buried, but also the fact that Ubisoft clearly didn't know what they actually wanted to do with it. Excluding DLC, there were only 3 entries to this franchise, and the only thing that really carries over between the titles is the hacking element. Watch Dogs was a dark, intriguing thriller that provided a nuanced view on the world we're seeing, whilst also embedding the idea of a highly technologically interconnected world becoming a quiet dystopia. Watch Dogs 2 was a goofy take on San Francisco that removed a lot of the elements that made the first game interesting and replaced them with nothing. And Watch Dogs Legion is a futuristic, straight-up dystopian take on an American stereotypical perspective of London, which did admittedly see the return of some dark tones, but Ubisoft couldn't be bothered to write a main protagonist for the game so you can play as literally anybody. A gimmick that in the end of the day holds no value because your anchor point to the world you're observing is still compromised and you could only view it as the player. The point is, Watch Dogs, since the first game's release, has been in a state of perpetual metamorphosis. As a result, the brand only ever had a loose identity, and therefore, it's not likely to amass a huge fanbase. But in today's video, I wanted to focus on the Watch Dogs game I like, the first one, and explain how this IP, this brand, is the perfect example of wasted potential. Please enjoy. So let's begin by addressing a statement that gets hurled at any modern third-person shooter in which the world space is a city and you can happen to drive cars. The term GTA clone gets thrown around for a lot of games, not always in a negative sense I might add, but often it can be used to label a game as a half-assed attempt to imitate the Grand Theft Auto series. And that is in a sense an angle from which Watch Dogs can be analysed, but I don't outright agree with the statement as such. It's certainly not hard to imagine this game taking inspiration from the franchise that made a format not dissimilar to what this game has very popular indeed, but making the statement alone is oversimplifying this game and in turn oversimplifying the Grand Theft Auto series for the sake of a comparison that when you look at it in detail doesn't actually fit as well as you think it does. They're both third-person action-adventure games with an element of sandbox set in a contemporary city where you can drive cars. You can also shoot people in both, that's important too. But that's just mimicking our everyday world for the sake of fun, but with added violence. When you think about it, that's not something we actually can assign a monopoly to, because it's not a setting that took much imagination to arrive at least not on Watch Dogs' front. The Grand Theft Auto games are set in their own parody universe, in their own named cities, which allows them the freedom to craft that world, turning it into its own character for you to explore, that delivers non-stop social commentary effectively, in a cleverly composed, humorous way. Watch Dogs, on the other hand, is just set in Chicago, and delivers its chaos in a much more serious way to fit the dark tones of the main narrative. It isn't satirising something at every turn, it has its own commentary for sure, but its primary focus is its storytelling, delivering this mystery that just so happens to cross paths with a few well-made points about the technological era that we at the time were rapidly approaching. I also don't find Watch Dogs to be a hugely immersive open world game, it's largely just a means to an end, whereas Grand Theft Auto is a massively immersive open world despite being ridiculous at the best of times. I could go on and on, but it would just get boring if it hasn't already. I'm sure inspiration was taken from one of the biggest franchises in gaming. I'd even go as far as to say perhaps Ubisoft intended for it to be viewed as a competitor to GTA. But like most games of its like, it prioritises vastly different things. It isn't necessarily trying to replicate Grand Theft Auto, so I think the GTA clone comment is just a cheap jab. So let's quickly move on and talk about the premise of Watch Dogs. Chicago is run by a central operating system known as CTOS, which is probably what that stands for. An advanced digital information system designed by an evil corporation to manage the infrastructure of the city. However, that very same simplification of things also makes the entire city vulnerable to hackers, which is where our main protagonist Aiden Pierce enters the frame. Aiden is a hacker and thief turned vigilante following a job going bad, resulting in the death of his niece. Exploiting the city's digital weaknesses to use to his advantage, he's on a mission to single-handedly wage war against organised crime in Chicago in hopes that it would yield answers into who was truly responsible for the death of Lena, from which point he can exact vengeance, and punch walls for no reason. Using his hacking abilities via his phone, in many instances he can effectively alter the environment around him, depending on what he actually needs to accomplish his mission. And at times that means the game is a giant seamless puzzle, and beyond that it's a randomly generated trove of information. You can pry into random NPCs' personal data. Every single NPC has a name. You know their age, their occupation, their income, and some random bit of trivia about them, and mate, sometimes it gets rough. In fact, one of the most fun things you can actually do in this game is open the profiler and go for a walk and find out what creatures occupy this version of Chicago. Because if you look hard enough, you can find some really strange things. But the hacking aspect isn't just a gimmick. It is how Watch Dogs chiefly sets itself apart gameplay-wise, but it is an integral storytelling aspect. It isn't just there for gameplay convenience, though it provides an awful lot of it. It's essential to the world building of the Watch Dogs universe. The city is the system, and the game hinges on how various people exploit it. Not just Aiden and his allies, but also his enemies. And so within the realms of the plot's mystery, the city of Chicago forms the backdrop of a long-winded puzzle. One that applies to the plot and gameplay equally, eliminating the main concern that hacking would prove to only be a gimmick. Now, I won't pretend Watch Dogs' plot is anything phenomenal. It's rather standard run-of-the-mill thriller for the most part, enhanced largely by its main selling point. The storytelling is pretty good and easily consumed. The main protagonist of Aiden Pierce is genuinely compelling. He undergoes a journey on his quest for revenge, one where he develops and comes to terms with his own responsibility in his niece's demise. I don't think this voyage necessarily makes him feel better, but he certainly comes to embrace his role as the vigilante. He's constantly monologuing his assessment, both on the situation around him and the rationale behind his decision making, and besides that, his emotions. And it's good that that's still provided to the player somehow, considering Aiden does keep most of the characters in this game at an arm's length, and that adds complexity when there's dissonance between his actions and his thought process. Meanwhile, in game, the radio is also feeding you information about him, as his anti-heroic acts gain him some notoriety, so we can observe how he behaves, how he sees himself, and how everybody else observes him, the latter of which can be loosely dictated by the player's actions. Stopping crimes increases your reputation, killing innocents reduces it. The game doesn't seem to care if you pillage the contents of the impoverished bank accounts and then withdraw it at the closest ATM though. But the broad strokes are unhindered by the frankly flimsy morality system in general. Now, it's nothing unique for a character to be addressed in a non-linear fashion, especially a main protagonist. But the point is, legwork went in to make Aiden Pierce's story interesting. However, within itself it's not groundbreaking. It's just an enjoyable noir-esque thriller. As far as supporting characters go, this game does fine. There are two main allies to Aiden Pierce. Clara Leal, who is from the French part of Canada, and a bloke who goes by T-Bone Grady, a cyber terrorist and master of defenestration. and when he's not throwing people out of windows, he's a sound guy. There's also Geordie Chin, an amoral psychopath. He's a foil to Aiden's character in the sense that he has a contrasting approach to the job at hand, opting to go for humour while also murdering people. He isn't exactly an ally though, but rather a gun for hire. Regardless of his untrustworthiness, he is perhaps the most entertaining character in this game. On the antagonist front, things are a little bit weaker. Damien Branks is Aiden's former partner in crime, also suffering from the fallout of the Merlot job going south, and he blackmails Aiden to his own end. However, we play as Aiden, so we know naturally that it's going to end in his. We have Delford Wade, who goes by the name Iraq, a former soldier turned leader of the Viceroys, made identifiable by his orange puffer body warmer. He's an interesting hardy antagonist, and it's a shame we don't actually see more direct encounters between him and Aiden. As of all the antagonistic characters, he's perhaps the most physical threat. Then there's Lucky Quinn, the archetypal crime boss old man. Due to his vintage, he's not exactly a physical threat, but you know that due to his wealth, influence and status, he effectively runs the entirety of Chicago from the shadows, and that makes him an incredibly dangerous adversary nonetheless. He also has a hackable pacemaker, because also the profiler repeatedly does this guy dirty with the pictures. Why does it keep changing? Then we have Default, a hacker who's as faceless as he is voiceless. He simply communicates through his hacking, and has a rat mask. He's a pleasant guy, but he's more of a plot bloating device than a character. There are adequate characters on either side of this story to make a really intriguing interweaving plot, and it does create the back and forth you want in a rollercoaster narrative. Thanks to the use of findable audio files and phone calls on the fly, the characters feel more present than they in actuality are, and that allows you to experience the isolation of Aiden's world without having to opt for a slow pace. The only thing that does really get lost in the high-octane approach, in my opinion, is the antagonists don't feel as present as sometimes they perhaps could have. As a result, we have to use rationale to identify what makes each villain threatening rather than seeing it be distinguished, at least outside of the ending. Damien is distinguished as threatening because he knows Aiden, and exploits how he thinks. Lucky Quinn is distinguished as threatening because he doesn't just have money, he is money. He's survived a long time in the criminal underworld of Chicago and risen to the top, but for the most part he seems largely unaware of Aiden Pierce, and that absence of direct hostility for the most part means we don't actually see Aiden's skills stack up against Quinn's resources. You feel as if Aiden is never at a disadvantage facing him. But he's by no means bad. He's a sympathetic seeming but otherwise vindictive old man, which is a good villain archetype, I quite like it. And it's redeemed further by leaning into Aiden's irrelevance from Quinn's perspective. So it was made good by what it was given, but I feel as if it does miss opportunities to escalate intensity. However, the true missed opportunity is certainly Iraq. As the only villain in this story truly capable of taking Aiden head on in a physical confrontation, it's a bit of a shame that that only occurs once and it results in his death, which means we can't respect him for what he's intended to be, the physical rival. Because despite being set up to suit that role, even being the identity of the other hacker in the Merlot job that went south, which is a mystery established earlier in the plot, at no point does he even come close to being a nemesis to Aiden. As a result, Aiden Pierce doesn't really reach a low point in his mentality where he's been beaten physically. His journey was set in stone based on events that occurred before the game began. It changes rather predictably as the plot develops, but at no point is Aiden forced to reevaluate, he's just naturally introspective. In other words, his character development never really exceeds a comfort zone, or at least that's how it felt. It doesn't suffer for it badly. Aiden Pierce is written as an unstoppable force of nature, and it could be argued as a good thing that there isn't one character that everybody turns to when it comes to dealing with Aiden, because that would just make the plot more linear than it needed to be. It'd also make every other character aside from the one character who can face Aiden look incompetent. But as it stands, I find Iraq to be a heavily underutilized character in the current setup of the narrative of Watch Dogs. Away from that, this game also establishes another entity, one more neutral or at least harder to fathom, and that is the organisation known as DedSec, of which Clara Leal is a part of. A faceless entity not dissimilar to Bloom, the organisation behind CTOS. It's unclear what their intentions actually are, and that mystery is blown out the water immediately by Watch Dogs 2, in which they effectively become the assassins from Assassin's Creed, but hackers as well. As you go through the story and move through the world, on the radio you hear the DedSec manifesto as it's broken down for people, seemingly at random intervals, and it provides commentary about the world these characters occupy and the nefarious uses of CTOS, which is validated in turn by us being able to violate people's privacy. The game raises ethical concerns around how much of our data is actually in the hands of organisations and what they could theoretically do with that. It makes some fair points about a heavily interconnected technological society and how that can be used against quite literally anyone. But not Aiden, because he uses a facial recognition VPN of some description. He is the pixelated man. Aiden's use of the CTOS could also be argued to be unethical. He violates privacy on a daily basis and isn't above rinsing people's bank accounts for his own needs. The game doesn't do an amazing job of acknowledging that he possesses more power than he perhaps should, and that's acceptable considering this is chiefly an action fantasy, and the game does bring the morality of Aiden's own actions into question. But it's more general than just discussing his exploitation of CTOS and tends to hinge on the people he's killing, and then often he keeps doing it. To conclude the narrative discussion before it takes up like an hour, by no stretch of the imagination is the plot of the first Watch Dogs game bulletproof, but I feel as if it's a captivating, tonally consistent narrative that certainly suits the game, and it would have been nice if they kept this grey tone up, because it does make for interesting storytelling. So in that respect, an opportunity was wasted to establish the tone of the brand in this vein going forwards, but the true waste of potential that I see when I observe the Watch Dogs franchise is in the gameplay and stuff. At the surface level, the gameplay may bear some resemblance to the Grand Theft Auto series, but courtesy of the hacking element being prevalent through everything, the gameplay is transformed into something else altogether. There are numerous means through which you can complete tasks, and I often found myself favouring stealth wherever possible over direct confrontation. The hacking allows you to manipulate your environment and also create distractions. You can blow people up from a distance by luring them towards something vulnerable to being blown up and then blow it up along with them. You can take people down from corners, and you can go the traditional route of not doing much hacking at all. But you are provided a really neat means to tap into the environment you're provided with, and doing so makes you tackle objectives more methodically, and where stealth isn't consistently possible, you ride it out until you've thinned the ranks enough to take on the rest head on, and you have an arsenal of weaponry to fall back on in order to do just that. The game taps into stealth elements a lot besides, and it's here where the hacking becomes necessary to succeed a lot of the time. Also, you'll often find yourself doing hacking puzzles and analysing scenarios through alternative perspectives such as CCTV cameras, or simply just using your profiler to get the lay of the land before exposing yourself to combat. Shooting mechanics are bog standard, and you have your customary slow motion ability in there as well. That's pretty common in a lot of games. As for evasion and escape, you'll find chasing parties, whether they be police or fixers, are a bit more tenacious compared to the Grand Theft Auto series, for example. And this is done so that when being chased, you need to use hacking opportunities throughout the city to get an advantage and actually escape. The most impressive of which is the blackout option, where you cut the power to an entire portion of the city. Not only does it make you less visible, but it also really hits home the point that the entire city really is running off of this flimsy operating system. The chase mechanics have 3 stages for police and 2 for fixers. Fixers only chase you in mission segments, so the first step is kind of lost on them, but CTOS will scan for you, and if you're caught in a scan zone after committing a crime of some description, then you will be chased by the police. The CTOS scans do take the piss, so avoiding them 50% of the time is futile. Once you've broken the line of sight and gotten far enough away, you will have to escape a specific area, or indeed hide for long enough to avoid being redetected. So as much as you can bend CTOS to your will, it can also be used against you. The online is integrated in this way and can be perceived as something of an annoyance. Other players can join your game momentarily and hack you, and in these invasions they can steal your data, which I presume is all of the money you are yet to withdraw from the bank accounts you've hacked throughout the city. The other player may be disguised as an ordinary NPC acting all casual, or they may be actively trying to antagonise you for some fun. It's a griefing mechanic, basically, and so outside of when it annoyingly switched itself back on, I disabled this feature because I don't care for online elements at all. There is more to Watch Dogs Online, but per my previous comment, I probably won't address that. The game does have progression in the form of skill points invested into various graphs or trees, and these just expand your options in gameplay in a gradual sense. But here you can, to a limited degree, upgrade your driving, hacking, combat and crafting abilities. It's not too ridiculous, and without going too far out of your way, by the end of a playthrough you will have unlocked most of the things here. And that's because this isn't an RPG you're going to be sinking hundreds of hours into. Surprisingly, for a Ubisoft game, it appears to understand that, at least when it's approaching progression. The game's approach to side content is, of course, a bit of a different story. The game's world map kind of screams Ubisoft at you. It's so full of things to do, and not all of it is even worth doing. But at least it gives you ample time to appreciate the well-fitted UI, I guess. For example, I really like this game's minimap. It's a bit useless, but it looks good. A lot of the side content falls into the categories you'd expect from a Ubisoft title as well. You have effective viewpoints, CTOS towers, where you can unlock this area of the map, or at least unlock more information about the map, because there's nothing physically barring you from going there. And since you can see the map, it just tells you where all the content is and allows you to profile people in that area. Enemy hideouts, because where would we be without those? However, they are well designed and you can tackle them entirely in stealth. But there's always a target you have to take down in melee in these areas, and I don't get that. However, they are good fun. There's other content like checking in at hotspots around the city, and as we know, Ubisoft have always been fond of sliding in their landmarks. Also, who doesn't love illegal poker? There are digital trips where the game breaks tone because you're high as fuck. Wow! And there are also investigations to conduct. They're a tad tedious before they become interesting, but there are some interesting side stories in the Watch Dogs open world. Of course, as well, you can fight crime whenever you're told that a crime is occurring, and nothing is really done with this mechanic to make it more than just the same scenario over and over and over again. So it's a shame it's only really a reputation booster, as they could have done much more with the vigilante-oriented mechanics, considering Aiden being a vigilante is a big part of the plot. The game has a linear reputation system. When it's negative, people might call the police on you if they recognise you in public, and when it's positive, that just doesn't happen. Your reputation increases by fighting crime, but it decreases if you use unnecessary violence, or indeed start killing civilians. Other side content includes intercepting criminal convoys, which includes a very loud Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag Easter egg. There are fixer contracts in which you kill the fixer before the fixer kills you, but it certainly isn't the kind of game where all the content available will appeal to you, which is pretty standard for most games. I can't name a single game in which I like every piece of content that game provides. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised to discover there's a correlation between completionists and needing therapy. Anyway, the most fun thing to do in the open world of Watch Dogs for me has nothing to do with any of the content the game provides, but rather simply, like I said earlier, going for a walk, opening the profiler, and finding the strangest assortments of information possible. And then pair it with comparatively daft scenarios and you get shit like this. The profiler comes out with some unintentionally amusing results, but I'm not laughing at the game's expense. There are some nuggets in there that are intended to give you pause. And it's also interesting, in the real world, when you're walking past people in public, you don't know anything about them. You don't know their names, their age, you don't know their income or their occupation, and you certainly don't know random bits of trivia about them more often than not. And this game comes along and suggests that every single NPC within it has their own life. They don't, as they're not real. But it's a cool immersion feature that comes off of the back of the selling point, and that constant flow of passing detail elevates the game a lot. And I can always appreciate and respect when a game does little things like that right. Could it have done more with it? Possibly, but they did carry this over into 2 and Legion, which is alright within itself. But I find this game's strength comes from its combination of fluid gameplay, hacking elements, and an interesting, well-toned story. I like that the downsides of this fictional take on a technologically connected world are more subtle, and it's subtlety ultimately that I think was lost on Watch Dogs 2 and Legion. The loud approach and more light-hearted narratives didn't draw me personally into those games anywhere near as much. Ultimately, the first Watch Dogs felt like a much more focused game. It established its identity well, and despite a disastrous launch back in 2014, was appreciated by many. It had a selling point that set it apart from other contemporary open-world third-person shooters in which you can happen to drive cars, and that hacking selling point was universally applied to both the gameplay and storyline. albeit in a way where you could still see past it, to the other mechanics and the actual premise of the narrative. The game understood that it couldn't just rely on the innovation that set itself apart to actually be good, and so it's only one of many means to accomplish that rather than the entire point of the game. It is present across the board, but there is a point that goes beyond it. You're not just playing the game because. The issue is Ubisoft tried to reinvent immediately with Watch Dogs 2. It did evolve with the hacking gameplay at least, but the tone was altered to a more flat and light-hearted one, for the sake of appealing to players beyond the niche the first game established. The subtlety in storytelling was absent, and the game just couldn't take itself seriously. I don't think Watch Dogs 2 is a dismal game by any means, but it was immediately clear Ubisoft didn't know what to do to genuinely evolve the potential of the first Watch Dogs game. And then Legion had the play-as-anyone gimmick that I don't value over having a well-written protagonist. It was also set in a dystopian future version of London where everybody is a stereotype, so all the subtlety that made the first Watch Dogs compelling went entirely out the window. Which is a shame because underneath all the noise, the hacking mechanics were evolved further again. It was just a much more chaotic, less controlled approach, and the game didn't really have a tone at all. Not to mention there are some pointless RPG elements in it for some reason, like health bars. I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head because I can't put myself through playing it again. But you get the point I'm trying to make. All three Watch Dogs games are different in fundamental ways. They all have hacking and roundabout approaches to the same gameplay loop, but the world building is entirely inconsistent. And when that happens, a franchise isn't long for this world, because though it may have a selling point, it has no core identity. Which is a shame because Watch Dogs back in 2014 set the foundations for one pretty well. So if the Watch Dogs franchise is more or less dead these days, I can't say that I awfully mind. I can acknowledge that it's a shame and that's the point of the video. But I think it's clear that Ubisoft had no intentions of realising the original game's potential as they evolved into making games appeal to as many people as possible, which is good business on the one hand, but has cost them the brand identity of their biggest franchise as well. It would be no shocker if the Watch Dogs franchise has suffered an unceremonious quiet death, because at least with Assassin's Creed, Ubisoft created a recognisable brand before they shat on it. But who knows, maybe the rumours are false and Watch Dogs is not dead. I mean, it may as well be, but who knows. Thanks for watching my rambling nonsense. I'll see you soon.